Welcome. Let's talk about scopes. So when we did our first programming application, right, when we did the hello world, I told you to write all these lines of code, and I told you that I was not going to explain to you right there and then what they meant. I said that we needed them for our application to work, and that over time I will explain to you what these are. So in this video, you're going to understand one piece of all this code that we have written that we have no idea how it functions. And that is the scopes, and that is these pair of curly braces. These two curly braces, or rather everything in between these two curly braces, that's called a scope. Now this thing that we have here is the main scope. It's the first scope. It's the one that everything begins. Our code, our application begins right here. And so that's why we write our code inside of this main scope. So to talk about what a scope is, let's write another scope inside of this scope. So I can do something like this. Notice that I open a curly brace. Automatically Visual Studio adds the close curly brace because they always come in pairs. And then everything in between them, it's another scope. And to not get confused, I'm going to write here a comment and I'm going to call it inner scope, right? And so in here, I can come and I can write the code that we have always been writing. So I can say int my number, let's say this is 5, and I'm going to bring this inside, and I'm going to say here, let's just change this from count to my number. Okay, apparently I can't type, and then in here we put my number, right? This works perfectly fine. Nothing really changes other than the fact that our code is now inside of an inner scope, which is inside of the main scope. So you might wonder, well, what's the point of all of this? Well, before we answer that question, what I want you to notice is that our code is moved in a little bit forward, meaning it has been indented. So by default, us programmers, what we like to do is we like to indent our code by the number of levels of inner scopes that we go into. For example, the main scope, right, it goes at the very beginning of our columns. And then we indent a little bit, right? We tab in a little bit. And then we write our code in here. And then now that we have another scope, we write our code a little bit more indented. So I can have something out here that says int another number, and then this will be 7, let's just say. Well, notice that this is a little bit more to the left than this. And this is for us, the programmers, just to be able to look at this code and say, this is inside of a scope that is more inner than this other line of code, okay? However, we could totally write this like this. There is no problem. We could even move this all the way to the back. It makes no difference. Spacing makes no difference, as we mentioned in the previous videos. However, for us programmers to be able to see it properly and say, these are scopes. It's inside of another scope. Then we do some indentation, okay? So let me delete this to go back to this. So now what's the point of this? There is really no difference. Well, what happens in the scope is that anything that you declare inside of a scope, any variable that you create, such as my number, once you are done with the scope, once you reach the end, right here, all of that memory gets cleared. Meaning you no longer have that variable called my number. So in here, everything is fine. But now I'm going to grab this and I'm going to bring this outside of this inner scope. Notice that I automatically get this error, and if I put my mouse over it, it says identifier my number is undefined, which means this variable that we have here, my number, even though we have created it before we reach this part, this my number, when it reaches here, it gets deleted, and it's no longer available for anything that comes afterwards. So scopes are quite useful to isolate code. If you want to create some piece of code that you want it to do something on its own and not be part of anything that comes afterwards, you put it inside of some scope, and after that everything will be deleted. You get your memory back. Whatever memory this variable occupied in memory, once it comes to the end, it gets clear and it's available for other programs or for your own program to create other variables. Why would you want to do such a thing? Well, I can tell you that in many years of programming experience, I've only had to do this once. And the only time that I had to do this was to write tests. I wanted to do some tests, and I wanted those tests to be isolated. I wanted to use the same variable name, and I wanted to create the variable and define the variable for this particular test. So I made various scopes. I could do another scope right here, and this could be, let's say second inner scope, and let's call this one first inner scope. So in here, what I was doing is I had several tests, and I wanted this code to be isolated from the remaining of the code. But now there is a couple of things that we have to consider when we talk about scopes. As I mentioned, the moment that you leave the scope, everything that you have created inside of here, it's gone. It's not available for anything that comes afterward. And that's why this gives us an error. However, anything that is outside of the scope is available to the inside of the scope. So I can let me just grab this. I'm going to cut it out and I'm going to put it outside. And then let me delete the second inner scope for now. And in here, I can turn this in, right? Notice that in here, I have no error. I can actually run this and you will see that I have my number is 5, right? But if I move this inside and I didn't run it, let me run it so you guys can see it. If I try to run this, I will actually fail, right? It fails to even build because again, this, even though it's not showing the error, sometimes Visual Studio gets tricky and doesn't show the error. But even though the variable exists up here, it has been deleted and it's not available. Okay, so anything outside of the scope is available to the inside of the scope, and anything inside of the scope is not available to the outside of the scope. And if we have multiple scope, as we did earlier, right, I can have something like int my number is equal to 7, right? And if I put this up here, well, again, what do you think we're going to get? Are we going to get 5 or are we going to get 7? Well, this is a whole another scope, right? So when our code comes in, it creates the variable, sets it to 5, then it reaches the end, so it deletes this variable. Then it comes to the second scope, it goes in, creates the variable, sets the value of 7, and then it shows the value, my number. So in this case, it should show us the value 7, right? Here we go. So we're able to create multiple scopes, and then we're able to even create scopes within scopes, and then scopes within scopes. Now, is this really that important? Not really, at least not on their own. The reason why I am teaching you this, and the reason why I want you to learn this so early, is because scopes play a big part on programming structures. So when we start talking about selection and looping in the incoming videos, we need to be able to understand how scopes work, because scopes play a part of those programming structures. And so to understand that what's outside is available inside, but what's inside is not available outside, is very important. Now, before we wrap up this video, there's another thing that we have to talk about, and that is the variable name. So now, let me go and delete, let me put this here, and I'm going to delete this second, not that one, this one, right? What happens if I do this? Int my number is equal to 7. Now, before, if I try to write this like this, right, this wouldn't work, because if I try to build this, I will get an error, and this error will say my number, redefinition, multiple initialization, meaning I am trying to create a variable called my number twice. You cannot create two variables with the same name. It just doesn't work. However, what happens if I put it inside of another scope? Will it work? Well, let's try it. If I build this, it says build succeeded. Okay, there is no problems. And if I run this, what do you think we're going to get? Are we going to get 7 or are we going to get 5? Let's try it. So I run this. My number is 5, right? So what happens here is that we have created a variable called my number in the outer scope. But when we go inside the inner scope, we create another variable that has the same name. So now what happens is that this variable outside of the scope is no longer available to us. It is still existent. It has not been deleted. But there's another variable that now has that name. And because it's inside of the scope, it's within the scope where we're trying to use it, it prioritizes that one. And right now, there is really no way for us to use this one because it's hidden. We don't have a way to name it because the name is taken. So it is possible to declare variables that have the same variable name as a variable that's in the outer scope. However, have in mind that when you do that, you no longer have access to it. Although a lot of the times, if you are doing this, is because you really don't need the outer one. So that's okay. So instead, if you wanted to modify the outer one, then don't declare it. Simply use it, right? So in here, my number is 5. So what I'm trying to say here is, to show you an example, let me come down here. What do you think the value of my number here is going to be? Well, the value should be 7, right? It better be, because I said that once we go into the inner scope, right? The inner scope, this is gone, and what we have is this, right? But if you wanted to modify this value inside the inner scope, then don't declare the variable. Simply use it, right? So now what are we going to get? This should be now the value 5. So here you go. My number is 5. So indeed, you can use outer variables in an inner scope, right? And you can modify them. However, if you would like to use another variable completely different from the one in the outer scope, then you can simply redeclare it, and that would shadow the other one, making it hidden, and then you will be able to work with this one. Again, scopes on their own, I don't really see many people using them for many things other than testing things and some isolation of code, but they are important because we are going to use them with the other programming structures, okay? So we have learned a little bit about some code that we used to use in the past, and particularly these curly braces, which we know they're called scopes. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below. If you like this video, if you found anything useful about it, feel free to leave a like. And if you're new to this channel, check out the video series, check out the channel. And if you like what you see, subscribe. Be safe, and peace out.